We're going to take a few minutes and explore how to read and write about research articles, specifically the articles that are from peer-reviewed journals. So research articles are the ones you find through USCA's library in the databases, for instance. It might also be articles that you find from Google Scholar. These are not just standard website articles like readingrockets.com. These are the articles that have some kind of research background to them. And there's two types of research articles. There's practitioner and there's peer-reviewed. And practitioner articles are teacher-friendly articles. Typically they have pictures, they might have samples of how to implement the strategy that the article is discussing, but they are very much used for our current teachers in the field. Our peer-reviewed journals are research-based journals, meaning they have lots of either qualitative or quantitative data. They include participants. There's probably an intervention, and there's some kind of findings. Those never have pictures. They might have tables or charts, but they are our research articles. For this project, we want you to pick peer-reviewed journals. These are some characteristics of practitioner articles. Number one, they're always teacher-friendly. Two, they avoid statistical jargon. And three, they usually have an overview of our strategy and they usually outline ways to implement it. So again, these are the ones with our pictures and usually with samples of how teachers can actually implement the strategy in their own classroom. Here is an example of a title page for a practitioner article. So you'll see that there's blue and red fonts. There's a picture of a student at a desk. None of this would be on a researched peer-reviewed journal article. Now, I don't want to minimize practitioner articles because they certainly are valid. They're so useful and they're honestly most people's probably go-to. For this, because we want to focus on the research side, we want you to select peer-reviewed journal articles. And we've listed some characteristics on the screen. So it generally provides information about a research study. So you're going to see words like participants, setting. You might see the different types of research, qualitative, which might have a lot of case studies or interviews. Quantitative might have a lot of assessments or surveys. Some use mixed methods, which is a combination of qualitative and quantitative. You're also probably going to see headings for your dependent measures, which are typically your assessments or your interviews. Your independent measures are typically the intervention or the strategy being examined. And you'll have procedures or a methodology section. So actually, what did the researchers do and how did they implement the research part to examine whether the intervention or the strategy was effective? Here's an example of a title page of a peer-reviewed journal article. So you'll see it goes straight to the point. There's no pictures or there's no different colored fonts. It's just the title with the author's names and their affiliation. So we know there's two types of journal articles, practitioner or the peer-reviewed journal articles. Under peer review, there's also three types. So a meta-analysis, which is usually combining a whole lot of research studies about particularly one intervention or strategy, and then using a whole bunch of stats to figure out if that strategy is actually effective, and you can generalize those results. So for instance, the self-regulated strategy, development strategy in writing, there's lots of meta-analyses out there about how that is effective for students with disabilities and who need self-regulation. but there needed to be a lot of participants and a lot of studies in order to make that conclusion. A synthesis is just that. You're synthesizing a whole bunch of research about a topic. Maybe you don't have the stats to back up its effectiveness, but you're still reviewing a whole lot of articles and studies in one journal article. Intervention is probably the one that we are promoting for this project because typically they're a little easier to read for the statistical part. Intervention studies typically just examine one intervention or one strategy with a group of participants. And so that you have a participant, you try it out with them, and you have some kind of finding. Typically, the stats don't get so heavy, and there's not a lot of that jargon. So we are promoting and kind of encouraging you to stick with intervention studies. Once you figure out which types of articles you need to find, please go ahead and watch the video about how to find journal articles using our USDA library. And just remember, our articles must be peer reviewed, they must be from the United States, and they must be within like the last 7 years. The remaining parts of this video will talk about the different components of a peer-reviewed journal article and how to pick out the salient parts that we really want you to focus on as you're reading these articles. The first part of every peer-reviewed journal article will include a literature review, and that is where the authors are giving you the background knowledge, they're setting the stage for the intervention and their work that they're going to be describing later in the article. And so what we want you to focus on in this section is it's going to give you a lot of really important information as teachers. So it's going to say, hey, this works for these students and we know this, and they're going to give lots of citations. That's really helpful for you because, for instance, if you end up really liking a journal article, you can find other articles about similar topics using the citations that the article that you like used. And that would be embedded in the literature review. It'll also obviously be in the reference section. But that kind of helps you pinpoint what you're going to need for your research project. So please use the resources and the citations in the literature review, but also pay attention to kind of the main ideas. So here are some questions to consider. What are the salient points the authors cite to provide context for the study? So if you could give an elevator speech about the lit review, what would it be? And what are the main ideas of the lit review? So again, if you had to sum it up, either in an elevator speech or maybe for me, what would kind of be the highlights of the literature review? I don't want you to get bogged down by this because sometimes the literature reviews are rather long. I really want you to refine your skills and pick out the salient points and the main ideas for that elevator speech, because then you can use that information as part of your literature review for your research project. Typically, after the literature review, the author or authors will list the research questions. And this is really the purpose of the whole study. So, what did they examine? What intervention did they look at? And who do they think that it's going to be effective for? And usually, they are actually written as questions and are labeled as research questions. Sometimes it'll just say the purpose of this study is dot dot dot. But typically, that's right after the lit review. Next, you'll often see participants. Here, you're going to probably see a little bit of jargon. So, big N, capital N, is the total number of participants for the entire study. And depending on the disabilities in your study, you might have a small number. Think about our kids with autism, there's just not that many to examine an intervention for. But our students with learning disabilities, because that is a high incidence disability, the number of the whole study might actually be larger. And then you have little n or lowercase n, and that is the total number of participants in a subgroup. And so typically with an intervention study, you have two subgroups. You have a control group and you have an intervention group. The control group will take the same assessments, or maybe they conduct the same interviews with these students or participants, but they do not receive the intervention or the strategy. The intervention group takes the same assessments, completes the same interviews, but then does get the intervention or the strategy. And that, y'all, is so that we can compare. We can say, hey, these two subgroups have similar students, meaning maybe they all have autism, they all have communication issues, but the intervention was effective, meaning that these students in the intervention group had growth. They showed improvement while our students in the control group stayed the same. That's an indication that your strategy was effective. Also in this section, it's going to describe in detail who was in this study, and it probably will give the demographic information about the participants, like the age and the grade, the race or ethnicity, or their gender. And often it'll talk about how the students were selected. So perhaps it was convenience sampling, meaning that the students at one school got the intervention, but at the other school they didn't. Perhaps it was random. So if you have two schools, some at each school got the intervention and some didn't. That will be talked about in the participant section, but that's really important because when you're comparing strategies for like reading and writing, you need to know who they're working with in order to make some conclusions. Then you'll see setting, and that is just where the study took place. So it might just say something broad like Southwestern United States. It might say Central Texas. It might give East Tennessee as a little more narrow. It is probably never going to say Aiken, South Carolina, or something that very specific, because we want to protect the confidentiality of our participants when we do research. The next large section in a journal article will be the methodology, and typically that discusses the research design. So that's where you might have the qualitative or quantitative or mixed method design. What you need to know is qualitative is usually a lot of words, the case studies, the interviews. Quantitative are numbers. They took some kind of assessment, for instance. Mixed methods uses both of those. You're also going to read about their dependent measures, and those are the assessments or the surveys or the interventions that were used in order to measure growth due to an intervention. Then you're going to talk or read about the independent measures, and that's the discussion about the intervention or the strategy that was implemented. And the procedures will typically follow that, because then the authors will describe exactly how they implemented the research study. The next section will talk about the results or the findings, and these are the results of the study as they relate to those research questions or that purpose statement that was right after the literature review. And they will note, did the authors discover any other results? So perhaps they learned something that wasn't a part of the initial research questions. They'll note those findings here too. Y'all, this can be cumbersome when reading. Sometimes, depending on the stats that they used, it can be very difficult to read. Do not worry, because on the next slide and then the next section, they will explain all of the information and the stats and what that actually means for teachers. In the discussion section, the authors will actually start talking about what the findings or the results mean. And so often this is a critical section for you to read. And especially if the results and the findings were tricky and had a lot of stats jargon, this is the place I would direct you to. This is going to talk about not only what the results mean, regarding the research questions, but they're probably already also going to talk about the implications for teachers and researchers in education, and that's an important part of this. So you're going to consider, did the results help answer the research questions, i.e., was the strategy effective for the participants, and were there any limitations to the study? And they're going to list that explicitly. Some things to consider with limitations, if they don't list them explicitly, would be sample size, meaning what was the number of participants in the study? Was it low? Well, then we probably can't generalize it to a whole group of people. Here are some considerations as you begin to draft or write your research report. You must use APA, you must use APA, you must use APA, meaning you need a title page in APA, you need headers in APA, you need in-text citations in APA, and you need a reference page. For this project, you don't need an abstract, but just know that typically you would. You might consider headings when you are writing your paper, and honestly, my best suggestion is to review our rubrics and use those headings if it's applicable. If you're a really good writer and you can synthesize information beautifully, then perhaps you don't need headings. But if you're a technical writer like me, headings are our best friend. As in all technical writing, you're going to avoid contractions throughout the whole paper. You're going to use an acronym only after you've spelled out the words first. So for instance, if I wanted autism spectrum disorder, I would write autism spectrum disorder parentheses ASD parentheses the first time, and then every other time I could just write ASD. Numbers less than 10 are spelled out. Numbers at the beginning of sentences are spelled out too. So if I had a sentence that started with 1,427, I probably would reword my sentence so that I'm not having to spell that out in words. The word data is plural, so anytime you're using that in a sentence, be sure to use like data are, for instance, instead of data is. Stick with one verb tense throughout. I suggest the past tense, but honestly, it's up to you. Just be consistent. And remember, the study didn't find, the authors found. The study didn't examine, the authors examined. So we never want to put an action like that on a journal article. We want to put that action on the people who did it.